I mean, this guy he was the guy you want to marry your sister or your daughter. I mean, he just couldn't find any flaws in this guy at all.
He had written her phone number down on a piece of paper and given it to the other server to give to Scott. When he gave it to Scott, Scott just looked at it and threw it in the garbage because he thought it was kind of a joke until she came back. As I said, she wasn't intimidated.
How did you know you were in love? Driving along the highway, I remember vividly, and for no reason, I was just smiling. That's the biggest smile. And she asked me, "What the heck are you smiling at?" And the only thing was that she was there.
Today, how are you remembering your wife and your son?
That's very personal that I continue to look for, obviously. Times when it's difficult to go on, obviously. So thanks very much.
At the end of our last episode, Scott and Laci just spent their first Thanksgiving together with her family in Modesto, and the trip had gone exceptionally well. He was a perfectly charming gentleman during his stay, and left a good impression with them as they headed back to school. The two of them looked forward to finishing their semester at California Polytechnic, and to spending their first Christmas together. But they'd been planning a bit of a surprise for both sets of their parents as the holiday approached, and in mid-December, she and Scott announced that they would be moving in together. They'd been dating for a little over 6 months when Laci packed up her little cottage by the coast, and moved into a small apartment near downtown San Luis Obispo with Scott. The two were inseparable by then, and after the family introductions on both sides had gone so well, their parents saw no reason to discourage their further commitment to each other. They were a beautiful couple, and from all accounts they were amazing together, never a hint of trouble between them, and always wearing matching beaming smiles. Shortly after their move, with their first Christmas as a couple now just days away, Laci wanted her present for Scott to be special, and she'd gifted him a golden retriever puppy. Laci promptly named him Mackenzie, after certifying he was the cutest one of the litter and bringing him home to Scott. The owner told her that Mackenzie'd been dropped on his head by his mother, and during their visit to Modesto over their holiday break, she and her mom noticed that the puppy seemed unusually sleepy. He hadn't woken much during their entire stay, not even when the Christmas tree fell over onto a table and made a loud crash of breaking glass. Laci only loved the puppy more after learning he'd been dropped on his head, but now that he seemed so lethargic, she began to worry that he might have been seriously injured by the fall. Mackenzie got a vet checkup once they got back to their apartment in San Luis Obispo, where he received a clean bill of health and eventually became more alert. Scott absolutely loved his gift, and they were both grateful that the fall on his head hadn't done their new puppy any permanent damage, but it wasn't long before Scott, Laci, and Mackenzie outgrew their one-bedroom apartment near campus and began looking for more room to roam. They found a house for rent in the country with tall prairie grass for Mackenzie to romp through, and chickens next door for him to bark at. The little ranch-style home was charming and unique, with space enough for a large garden and a small creek running through the yard. Laci's favorite feature was the large shade tree growing up through the front porch, and it led to her nicknaming their new place the Tree House. Their life together seemed to be off to an amazing start. The attractive young couple beaming brilliant happy smiles, with their adorable puppy frolicking in the wildflowers of their cute country treehouse, must have made a near-perfect portrait of young love, at first glance. But soon after they moved into the treehouse came the first sign of trouble, the first issue revealed to outsiders anyway, and it could have been much more serious had the choice been made to file charges against Scott. At some point during the early part of 1995, he was accused of stealing some cash from the golf course where he worked in the pro shop. Laci called her mother soon after and casually described the situation as a misunderstanding, and while her mom said she didn't sound upset, her opinion is that her daughter wouldn't have mentioned it if it hadn't been worrisome for her. However, her mother Sharon was outwardly concerned and asked Laci for more information, and while she didn't get many more details, she did understand clearly that Laci backed Scott and believed in his innocence 100%, unable to logically understand why he would lie to her about it. The golf course chose not to press criminal charges, with the agreement that Scott wouldn't come back. But Laci never wavered in her support, continuing to confidently defend him, believing he'd been fired unfairly and that he was being punished for something he hadn't done. And because there were never any official charges laid, the only record we have of the accusation against him is Laci's mention of it to her mother. Without it, it may well have never happened, which is exactly how the couple carried on afterward. The months went by, Mackenzie grew, and as another year together drew closer to its end, Scott continued to be her dream guy, and the pair seemed to be more in love than ever before. As another December approached, Laci'd been telling her mother for some time that she expected a proposal from Scott was imminent. Ron and Sharon picked up the same impression from him over the previous months and anticipated he'd pop the question soon as well. While planning their second Christmas together, Scott made sure it would be even more memorable than their first, while at the same time ensuring that another life-changing moment for Laci would coincide with the season. He proposed just before they headed to Modesto to spend another holiday with her family, and while she gleefully accepted, he hadn't given her a ring. Scott told her he had an engagement ring for her but said that it was in San Francisco with a friend, and it's unclear when he finally did put it on her finger. So, with no ring but still about to burst with excitement, Laci called her mother to share the happy news. But her mom's reaction was less than thrilled, and Laci surely picked up on it as she heard her respond with a flat, "Sounds good," after telling her Scott had finally popped the question, which might have been an even bigger disappointment than not having a ring. But Laci'd never been one to dwell on the negative, and simply tried to address her mom's concerns. Sharon didn't have an issue with the proposal. She liked Scott and she could plainly see that he loved her daughter. There was never any question from anyone who knew them that Scott always treated Laci very well. Her concern was for her coursework and the fear that a wedding planned before her graduation date could spell disaster for her degree. Laci knew her mom was worried about a conflict with school, but she desperately wanted her mother to share in her excitement, so she assured her that they wouldn't be setting a date for any time soon, not until after graduation, certainly. Sharon was appeased when Laci told her they intended to wait, and when Scott asked for their blessing while they were in Modesto over Christmas, Ron and Sharon thought it was cute, and gave it gladly. But Laci may have overpromised a bit to get her mother on board with the engagement, perhaps not considering the long months she had left until graduation. While she'd been on track to graduate the following June with her major in ornamental horticulture, she'd recently added a minor in agricultural business to her degree, the same program Scott was completing for his major, and along with it came several courses necessary for her to graduate. If she hadn't made the changes, she and Scott would have been free to marry any time that summer if they so wished, but the addition of the new minor meant she wouldn't have her degree for another year. Soon after the proposal and the promise to her mother, Laci decided she just couldn't wait that long to marry her perfect fiancé, and a December graduation meant the weather would push her dream garden ceremony out several months further. And so, just a few weeks after the proposal, she changed the timeframe for the wedding to late summer, telling her mother they were so anxious to be married, they just couldn't stand to wait. Laci wanted to get married on the 2nd of August, which was her grandfather's birthday, but the venue she had her heart set on was unavailable, so she settled for the 9th. The months leading up to the wedding kept her busier than ever. She kept her grades up at school, continued working at the campus flower shop and took on most of the wedding planning herself, including the design and creation of the floral arrangements and bouquets for both the ceremony and the reception. She'd handpicked nearly every detail, but had some help from her mother picking out the perfect gown. One of the sweetest memories Sharon has of her daughter is shopping for the dress she would marry Scott Peterson in. Laci'd always envisioned herself walking down the aisle in a fluffy white ball gown, and when she and her mom spotted the perfect fairy tale dress in the shop that day, it was the first thing she rushed to try on. Her mom waited anxiously to see her little girl model her dream gown, but at just a hair over 5 feet tall and weighing just 100 pounds, she nearly drowned in the skirting. When she'd all but disappeared into the billowy tulle of the princess-style dress, her mother fondly remembers how they'd laughed together. She also remembers how stunning Laci looked when she finally found the perfect dress, a sophisticated but traditional gown sparkling with stitched pearls across the bodice. With the venue reserved, the flowers chosen and the size one dress altered to fit her tiny frame, she'd created a gorgeous celebration of her future with her flawless groom. But as we'll discover in a moment, some family secrets cropped up just before the big day that had Laci questioning who the Petersons really were, and whether she could place her trust in the family she was about to marry into. The Petersons, particularly Scott's mother Jacqueline, had some deeply buried secrets, and once uncovered they would send a shock through both families, just before he and Laci were set to exchange their vows. The first of Jackie's secrets, a much younger man named Donald Chapman, showed up on her doorstep in the spring of 1997, and with his arrival, Laci not only discovered her future mother-in-law's shocking past, but some much darker family history as well. And if you thought the younger man on Jackie's doorstep may have been evidence of a scandal, you'd be right, although it may not turn out to be quite what you expected. You see, Don Chapman was Jackie's son, her oldest boy, born out of wedlock in the early 1960s. She'd hidden the pregnancy and placed him for adoption when she was just 19. But even more surprising than the pregnancy and adoption was Jackie's decision to keep Don a secret for more than 30 years, and when he came out of the woodwork just before the wedding, the news threw everyone into a bit of a tailspin. It had come as a complete shock to Laci and her family, of course, but Don's existence was a bombshell for Scott and his half-brother John as well. Either of them had any idea they had an older brother, and it's unclear whether Lee, who she'd been married to for more than 25 years, ever knew about this portion of his wife's past either. And while we don't have much insight into the effect this revelation had on the Petersons or how they reconciled with it, we do know a bit about Laci's reaction to the decades-long secret, and the stark contrast between the mother-in-law she thought she knew, and the woman who'd buried it so deeply all those years ago. Don was quickly introduced to the immediate family, including Laci, who'd absorbed the shock as well as she could, and welcomed Don as far as she was able, having not been made an official Peterson quite yet. She was also gracious enough to invite Don and his family to the upcoming wedding, telling her mother it was an easy decision to include them in the event even though they'd only just met, explaining that her wedding was a family event, and Don was family, simple as that. But for Laci, it was more difficult to work through the secret Jackie kept, and we'll hear her concerns spelled out in a future episode as she shares her doubts with her mother. However, Scott seemed to roll with the news fairly easily, and though he was certainly shocked along with everyone else, once the initial jolt of surprise wore off, he determined he liked Don well enough, and not much more came of it. The families carried on and then the wedding preparations resumed, but just as things calmed down and normalcy returned, the peculiar situation played out again. This time, it was a woman who sought Jackie out, wanting to learn more about her birth mother. The discovery of yet another relinquished child from Jackie's past beckons us back in time to uncover more about Scott's roots and the dark precursors that may have led to the secret adoptions of his unknown older siblings. Jackie Peterson was born Jacqueline Latham on the 16th of September, 1943, in San Diego. She was the only daughter of Lita Helen and John Harvey Latham, who'd already had 2 sons together and went on to have another after Jackie came along. Her father John ran an auto salvage and tire repair shop, while her mother, who went by Helen, stayed home and cared for Jackie and her 3 brothers. That is until a few days before the Christmas of 1945, when her father failed to return home from his shop. Shortly before quitting time on the 20th of December, John called his wife to let her know he'd soon be leaving the shop for the night, but as 2-year-old Jackie and her brothers watched for him to arrive home, they were disappointed when he never showed. And although he still hadn't returned or called Helen by the time the children were tucked in their beds that night, she wasn't overly concerned, later telling police that her husband often went out with the boys, when they asked why she hadn't reported him missing. John was found just after 5:30 the following morning by an employee named Mr. Flynn. Flynn was one of John's truck drivers, and when he'd arrived for work the morning of the 21st, he noticed his boss's car parked in the same place it had been the night before, and when he pulled through the gate, he saw John lying in a pool of blood with a massive wound to his head, noting that the door to the shop was left unlocked and an empty wallet lying next to his body. Police determined John's wallet should have contained nearly $400 from the day's receipts, and although they were also able to estimate the time of the murder to be around 9 p.m. the previous evening, and found the rusted pipe used to bludgeon him to death not far away, it would be another 4 years before they charged anyone with his murder, though they would find that the culprit slipped through their fingers during the first few hours of the investigation. 28-year-old Robert Sewell, who had previously worked for John changing and capping tires in the shop, was arrested for murder the day after he was found, but he was released several hours later after being questioned. Prior to his release, he told officers that on the night of the murder he'd been drinking with friends at several local bars before returning home around 9 p.m. He said he went out again that night to get food for his wife, and came back around 11:30. But after his release, Sewell and his wife promptly left San Diego for Los Angeles, not returning until 4 years later, and on the 18th of January 1949, just one day after returning to town, he was promptly arrested again on suspicion of robbery and drunkenness in a separate incident. 2 days after that, Officer Ormsby spoke with a close personal friend of Sewell's named Mr. Massey, and during the interview, Massey relayed a story his friend told him about burglarizing the tire shop and killing John Latham 4 years earlier. When questioned again, Sewell denied any involvement in the murder, but the following day, officers brought Mr. Massey into the interrogation room to convince his friend to tell the truth, and Sewell voluntarily gave a lengthy statement, in which he admitted to robbing John of his wallet, described hitting him with a pipe found at the scene, and burglarizing the shop for another $100 before leaving. Sewell armed himself with a pipe before coming through the gate to the salvage yard around 8:30, and he'd watched John sort the day's receipts through a window for more than 10 minutes, waiting for him to exit the building. Shortly after, John called home to let Helen know he'd be on his way, telling his wife he loved her for the last time. Sewell caught him unaware in the dark, attacking him with the pipe before he was even able to turn the key to lock the door for the night. The following is a description of the crime in his own words. He walked out, and I was standing right there and I just, boom, let him have it. He made a step and I crowned him. I hit him on the head, and he fell on an ankle like that on his arm, and didn't move, and I got kinda nervous. Sewell also explained that he'd used some of the money from the tire shop to get he and his wife out of town to Los Angeles just after the murder, but robbery may not have been the only reason he targeted John. As we said, John Latham hired Sewell to work in his shop, and though we're not sure how long he was employed there or why Sewell didn't work out, he was fired just 2 days before his murder, causing prosecutors to add revenge to the list of possible motives for the attack. Ultimately, Sewell's confession coupled with the evidence earned him a life sentence with no parole in nearby San Quentin, but controversy surrounded his trial and conviction after Sewell claimed that the 3 days he was in police custody being questioned about the murder, he was beaten and intimidated into a confession. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP, got involved in the case on Sewell's behalf, and demonstrations carried on outside the courthouse during his trial. Sewell claimed he was beaten on the 22nd of January and named specific officers involved in the violence against him, but booking photos taken on the 25th didn't reflect any of the serious injuries he claimed to have received, including having his eyes gouged. The main officer he'd accused of beating him wasn't on duty the day he claimed the injuries occurred, and none of the witnesses Sewell brought to trial were able to substantiate his claims, leading to a swift conviction, though he would die of natural causes just 2 years into his life sentence. Sadly, Helen began to fall apart long before then, and by the time Sewell went to trial for killing the father of her 4 small children a week before Christmas, she'd had a total breakdown and was no longer able to properly care for them or herself. At the time of the murder, their oldest son John Jr. was 5, James was 4, Jackie was 2, and their youngest brother Robert was just 3 months old. Sewell's greed and brutal retaliation set the chain of events that followed into motion like dominoes across the decades, thrusting Jackie and her siblings onto an abysmal path for the remainder of their childhoods, and affecting the way she would relate to her own children in the future. Jackie was 5 years old when she was removed from her mother's care, separated from her brothers, and placed in a Catholic orphanage called the Nazareth House, and while her mother did come and visit her there, for a long time the visits were limited to just once a week, until the restrictions were eventually relaxed, and they were able to see each other more frequently, but Jackie wouldn't leave the orphanage or live with her mom again for nearly 8 years. Her ticket out of the children's home and back into her mother's house turned out to be a scholarship she'd earned to attend the Catholic high school when she was around 13. Apparently, while attending this school, Jackie was permitted to live with her mother Helen, and after so many years apart, and Jackie on her way to becoming a woman herself, the The two of them tried to make up for time lost after her mother's nervous breakdown 8 long years before. But sadly, not long after Jackie's return to her, Helen got sick, and Jackie's short time being a daughter to her soon came to a tragic end, when she began to become her nurse. As Helen became more ill, Jackie took on more of her care, and as she was working through her senior year at the Catholic high school, her mother became terminal. Helen lived to see her only daughter finish high school, but she also lived to see her become pregnant soon after. Unwed with child and raised in the Catholic tradition, wasn't an optimal situation for a young woman to find herself in during the early 1960s, and her options were limited. As Jackie's pregnancy progressed, her mother's health only continued to decline, and when she was around 6 months along, her mom passed away. She'd carried the baby to term and worked through the adoption process, knowing she couldn't care for the child alone, at 19. The father had taken up with another woman by the time the baby came due, and Jackie delivered with no one but the hospital nurses by her side. With both parents now gone, young, broke, and alone, she made the choice to place him with another family. The little boy, Scott Peterson's oldest brother, Don Chapman, was born on April 2, 1963, and nearly 35 years later his curiosity, and maybe a bit of loneliness, would drive him to find Jackie Latham Peterson to learn more about where he came from. Don's adoptive parents had also both passed away by this time, and while he had a sister who had been adopted into the same family, they were now estranged and no longer spoke. Don was married though, and he had 3 children of his own. But when Don set out to learn about his birth mother, he was surprised to find more than just Jackie and his new half-siblings in Morro Bay. He quickly discovered that Jackie became pregnant again, nearly directly after placing him for adoption in 1963. This pregnancy was with a different man, but he didn't leave her when he learned of the baby, instead offering to marry Jackie and provide for her and their child, but she turned down the proposal and broke ties with the young man, and again went through birthing and adopting her baby alone. And this time, Jackie learned more about the prospective adoptive parents, Geraldine and Thomas, and what she knew of them sounded lovely, though they never met in person. Early on, she was convinced that Thomas and his wife Jerry could give her baby girl a life she could only dream of providing, but when the due date drew closer, Jackie learned that Jerry was sick with a potentially fatal illness, and she nearly decided to find another couple to adopt her baby, knowing the last thing she wanted was for her little girl to grow up without a mother. Thomas Grady was able to convince Jackie that if need be, he was both willing and able to provide everything her child might need, even if he did lose Geraldine to cancer. His argument swayed her decision, and reassured that her baby would be in good hands. On the 8th of July 1965, she sent the only daughter she would ever have home with the Grady family, having never met either Thomas or Jerry in person, which is a common custom in closed adoptions. But as Don discovered through more investigation, just a few months later Jackie found herself pregnant yet again. This third pregnancy, with a third father, was set to play out and resolve in much the same way the first two had. Jackie was no longer in a relationship with the man she lay with, and her prospects and position hadn't improved since she'd given up Don or Anne. She planned to put this third child up for adoption as she'd done with his 2 older siblings, until a conversation with her doctor caused her to rethink her decision. He'd been her doctor through her previous 2 pregnancies, and he happened to be a personal friend of Geraldine and Thomas Grady, connecting them with Jackie to facilitate their adoption of Anne, only a year earlier. Somehow, Jackie's doctor successfully convinced her to keep her baby and raise him on her own. John E. Latham, named for her murdered father, was born on July 16, 1966. It's not clear what Jackie's doctor said to convince her to keep John, or why he wouldn't have possibly encouraged placing him with the Grady family as he had done for his older sister the year before. The Gradys were well equipped to be parents, with ample resources and stable lives. They had done very well raising Anne, and she went on to have a good life with the Gradys. Geraldine ended up beating cancer, going on to have 2 biological children with Thomas, and living a long, fruitful life. And though it wouldn't turn out to be her blood brother John, the Gradys did adopt a son to be a brother to Anne, and they would grow to have a very close relationship. She and her adopted brother Stephen were the only kids in the Grady household until Jerry's 2 biological children, Susan and Michael, were born several years later, and the time they spent growing up together created a strong bond between them. Stephen's father was a mobster, as was his grandfather before him. His grandpa was a notorious and ruthless gangster known as Midge Renault. His real name was Salvatore Annunziato, but apparently, he decided to go by Midge. Eventually, Midge crossed the wrong people and got himself thrown off of a bridge for the mistake. Midge's son, who was Stephen's birth father, was so terrifying to his mistress that she fled to San Diego when she learned she was pregnant with Stephen, knowing he would likely kill her when he learned of the baby. She hid at her aunt's home until he was born and found a safe, loving, permanent home for him with the Gradys. Anne had a happy upbringing with Stephen, Susan, and Michael, and she loved her adoptive parents very much. She never felt anything lacking or had much curiosity to learn more about her birth mother. Anne became aware she was adopted at around the age of 6, but had only ever investigated her origins once. With time to kill in a microfiche room at the library as a young woman, she decided to try to find her real mother. Not long into her search, she discovered her mother's maiden name was Jacqueline Latham, and she found the record of Jackie's marriage to Laci Peterson as well. But she abruptly stopped her search and never picked it up again, feeling that looking into Jackie was a betrayal of her adoptive parents in some small way, not feeling the desire to know more strongly enough to keep digging. It would be nearly 2 more decades before the Petersons would enter her world in any significant way, but instead, when they did, the brief time they had together nearly ruined her life. During the years following the adoptions of Dawn and Anne and the addition of John, who she was now working hard to raise on her own, Jackie worked a few different jobs, including a short stint at an airline. This stage of her life was much kinder and far less tragic for her than those of her youth, and though it must have been challenging, she'd done well caring for young John, and eventually enrolled herself in Mesa College, and it was there, in a history class, that Jackie Latham met Laci Peterson. Jackie and Lee married on November 20, 1971, when John was around 5 years old, and Scott was born less than a year later. Lee was working at a trucking company at the time, and he wasn't earning much of a wage doing it, resigning his small new family to a modest existence in La Jolla, and by 1975, Lee decided to take a risk, starting his own business. His new company was based in San Diego, and they made crates, and so Lee aptly named it San Diego Crating, and quickly began gaining customers for industrial, commercial, and specialty freight shipping along the coast. Lee's risk paid off, and after a couple of years the business was profitable enough for him to quit his job at the trucking company and begin pulling a salary for himself through the new business. Soon after, Lee bought Jackie a dress boutique in La Jolla, and she called it The Put On. They would drive to Los Angeles a couple of times a month to buy designer dresses to stock the shop. Jackie ran the boutique full-time for a couple of years, and would frequently bring her sons to work with her. At the time, John was 6, and Scott was less than a year old. Jackie had an area in the back of the store with a crib for the baby, and there were accusations of neglectful behavior from her, stating that she would tend to ignore the boys while running the store, but it's not clear how accurate those reports are. Once he started to crawl, he had the run of the shop, playfully hiding in the center of the racks of dresses, and Jackie's customers adored him, for the most part. Though that sentiment may not hold true for one woman who'd had her toe bitten by Scott while browsing for a cocktail gown. They decided to sell the Put On after a couple of years, and Jackie began working with Lee, keeping the books at San Diego Crating. Though Lee's company was successful, it's been said that he overextended himself, maintaining the appearance of having wealth to compensate for his humble beginnings. Rumor has it that he was somewhat embarrassed of his past, and tried to erase his previous life as the son from a poor immigrant family, with luxury cars and extravagant homes. Laci Peterson was born May 9, 1939, on a small farm in Worthington, Minnesota to his parents, Arthur and Marie. His grandmother immigrated from Lithuania alone at the age of 15, with the promise of a job in Minneapolis. Her daughter Marie, who would go on to become Lee's mother, grew up in a lower-middle-class immigrant neighborhood on the north side of Milwaukee. The youngest daughter in a family of 8 girls, Marie worked in a factory before marrying Lee's father, Arthur. Arthur Peterson grew up in Walnut Grove, Minnesota, the setting for the stories of Laura Ingalls Wilder and the iconic TV series Little House on the Prairie. Lee also had an older brother named Joel, and as children they lived in St. Paul, but moved north to White Bear Lake when the boys were 8 and 10. Lee's dad ran a convenience store there for a while, until a bad investment bankrupted the family, and they had to move again. After this, the family lived in a dilapidated resort that had long been closed for business, after Lee's dad struck up a deal on the rent with the owner. Arthur began work doing typewriter repair, and his mother Marie cleaned the affluent houses in the area to make ends meet. In high school, Lee joined the Navy Reserves and subsequently signed up for a 2-year stretch of active duty directly after graduation. Just before completing his service, he married his high school sweetheart, Mary. Mary was Sicilian, and she had come to the States with her family when she was just 11. After they married, Lee completed a 2-year electronics course at Northwestern University Minneapolis, and began working in the sales department for the trucking company soon after. Lee and Mary had 3 children together in quick succession. Susan was born in 1960, Mark in 1962, and Joe in 1963. In 1967, the couple decided to move from Minnesota to California. Lee was able to relocate his sales position with the trucking company from their Minneapolis office to their San Diego location. He worked in sales for the trucking industry for several more years, before using the GI Bill to attend Mesa College in pursuit of a career change, but Lee and Mary would divorce long before then. Another rumor that swirls around Lee is that he was distant with his wife and children, and that the issue was the main cause for he and Mary to split, but there are other reports claiming quite the opposite, at least after their divorce. Mary and their children, Susan, Mark, and Joe, lived just a few blocks away from Mesa College, where Lee'd gone back to school and would eventually meet Jackie. It's been reported that Lee would see the children nearly every day, picking them up for burgers in the evenings or just stopping by to play ball with them in the front yard. At some point after he and Jackie were married, and he'd completed his degree in transportation management at Mesa College, Lee formally adopted John, making him an official Peterson. Though John would go on to get into some sort of trouble during his teen years that caused his parents to essentially kick him out of the house. The details surrounding this incident are unclear, and it's not known whether the trouble was legal, personal, or something else, but John was ultimately sent away to live with other relatives for a while. Again, there are no details to specify where John lived, except that it was somewhere outside of the state of California. We don't know how long he was away either, but eventually, John returned to the family fold, and it appeared the situation was resolved by then. Scott's grandpa Arthur lived with their family periodically throughout his youth, and when his grandmother Marie passed away in 1970, his grandpa took the loss extremely hard, still grieving when he was born nearly 2 years later. The new baby seemed to help him to cope with his grief, and he formed an instant bond with his new grandson. Sadly, when Scott was 14, Arthur came to stay with their family for the last time, passing away in his sleep on his first night in their guest house. Growing up, Scott formed a strong bond with his father as well. His dad would frequently take him to work with him, and often plan hunting and fishing trips, though their largest shared interest was certainly golf. Lee would often cut his workdays short, leaving his business in the hands of his managers in order to take Scott to the golf course. After countless hours on the fairway together, Lee helped and encouraged Scott with his application and admittance to Arizona State, where Scott would attempt to live and breathe golf, even laying AstroTurf on the roof of his dorm so he could practice whenever he had the chance. And when that dream crashed and burned, and Scott found himself without the obvious direction golf previously provided for his life, his father Lee was there for him with a job and a roof over his head. Jackie always tried to be there for Scott too, but just as her golden boy got older and his problems became more complex, her adopted children did the same, growing into adults and facing their own myriad of issues. While Scott was dealing with his dilemma over the direction his life would take after realizing he would never be a professional golfer, her oldest son Don was 2,000 miles away, contemplating major questions about his life as well, like not knowing who or where he came from, or why his mother had given him up. A few more years would pass before Don acted on his curiosity and he began his search for Jackie, though she wasn't difficult to track down. In early 1997, Don found her still living in Morro Bay, still married to Lee Peterson and still excited about the news of Scott's engagement to Laci over Christmas just a few months before. Don soon made plans to travel across the country to meet her, but along the way his thoughts turned to his sister, another sibling he'd never known, and he decided to ask Jackie about him. By the time Don called her, he had not only had a successful first visit with Jackie, he had also met Lee, Laci, and Scott, and Laci already invited him to their August wedding, along with his wife and their 3 children. Don must have felt welcome, because soon after this he called Anne out of the blue, introduced himself as her brother and offered to introduce her to her birth mother, Jackie. He explained that he had already gone to meet their mother, to get a feel for her before calling Anne to set up a reunion. He also encouraged his new sister to take her time considering the decision, realizing the news of a brother was overwhelming enough without bringing Jackie into the equation, but he told her the Petersons seemed like good people, and that Jackie seemed like a good woman. Then he offered to go with her, should she decide to meet her birth mother. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoy the content, please consider supporting the channel by subscribing, sending a super thanks or giving the episode a like. Join us for our next episode as we tag along with Anne to her first encounter with Jackie, and discover her impression of her new brothers, Don Chapman and Scott Peterson. We'll also get Laci's reaction to the discovery of the adopted children from Jackie's past, and the immediate drama the situation added to her upcoming wedding. And though we didn't get to the dark secret Laci kept from her family and friends about Scott in this episode, it will definitely unfold next time, so continue on to part 4 of the series to get all the details. And as always, until next time, stay safe, be kind, and memento mori.